What did I learn from this experience? What I learned is that what you do in the wrong house is always more important than what you do in the right house. You go into the right house, you capture a terrorist. You take one guy off the street, you might shut down a cell for a week, maybe 2 weeks. But at the end of the day, the violence will return. You go into the wrong house and you do the wrong thing, you make the enemy of a family, perhaps an entire tribe, maybe even an entire province. Fast forward now to Indonesia, September 2009. Detachment 88, which is Indonesia's elite counterterrorism unit set up after 9/11 by the U.S., trained and funded, has been searching for several years for a man named Noor Muhammad Top. Noor Muhammad Top is the guy who was behind the Bali bombings. He's the leader of Jemaah Islamiyah, the al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorist organization in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. He's also behind several hotel bombings in Jakarta, and he's been on the run for years. He's the #1 most wanted terrorist in Southeast Asia. The police, Detachment 88, get a tip. An associate of Top lives in central Java. Instead of rushing the house and raiding it, they send policemen, and they do undercover surveillance for a week, gathering evidence. After that, they capture the man, bring him in for an interrogation. And who do they bring in to advise them on that interrogation? None other than a man named Nasser Abbas. Nasser Abbas used to be the #3 guy in Jemaah Islamiyah. But after he was captured by the police and turned, he became an advocate against violence and now works for the police and advises them on interrogation strategies. He wrote a bestseller in Indonesia about why violent extremism is wrong. And Nasser Abbas, along with Detachment 88 interrogators, analyzed this young man and determined that the most important thing to him is his family and supporting his family. And that's why he joined JI. So they offer him money to support his family in his captivity, treat him with respect, never criticize him or his affiliation with JI, never use harsh methods, no enhanced interrogation techniques. They present him with the evidence that they've collected over a week, basic law enforcement approach. In the Army manual, they call it We Know All or File and Dossier. And the man turns in a matter of hours. He tells the policeman the location of Noor Muhammad Top. They run to the house, and after a 6-hour gunfight, they kill Top. I highlight these stories so that I can talk about 3 themes. And those are, who are interrogators? How do we go about improving both interrogators and interrogation techniques? And how can we maximize interrogations to achieve our strategic objective, which is countering violent Islamic extremism? Who are interrogators? 80%, maybe more, of the interrogators on a daily basis who are interrogating al-Qaeda members or other terrorist suspects are in the Army. And the average age of those interrogators is about 22 or 23. They come in out of high school to basic training, then they go perhaps to a year of language school, maybe not, and then through a 5-month interrogations course. When they get to Iraq or Afghanistan or Guantanamo Bay, for many of them it's the first time they've ever been outside the U.S. It's the first time they ever talked to a Muslim or an Arab. Is that a bad thing? I would argue no. Our young people today, this next generation, are the perfect raw material from which to craft an interrogator. Why? Well, let's look at the 3 major mistakes we made early on conducting interrogations after 9/11. The first, interrogators didn't understand how our enemy organized, which is more like the mafia or like a criminal gang, not like rank-and-file soldiers. We didn't understand their culture and how that affects interrogation methods. And we were unprepared for the fact that in past conflicts, direct questioning and logical reasoning approaches worked 90% of the time, and that fell off dramatically. Yet, this next generation Americans are perfectly suited to address these 3 issues. First of all, this is the Facebook generation. Anybody here on Facebook? I know most people won't admit it. Al-Qaeda is organized like Facebook. It's not, you get recruited, you get signed up, you sign a contract, you progress up through the ranks. It's organized around social networking. I have a friend, I have a cousin. I know a guy who can get money. I know a guy who can get weapons. Maybe it's the same guy. Maybe he has a relative. Maybe you run into an old friend on the street you haven't seen in 10 years. kind of like when that person contacts you on Facebook that you haven't talked to since high school. Our young interrogators understand Al-Qaeda organization intrinsically because they grew up in this social networking culture. They're also more globally aware and culturally curious, I believe, than older Americans. Because of the internet, because of our global community, they're more likely to know about the tenets of Islam or cultural differences, holidays and festivals. And lastly, you're going to love this one. I suggest that they're better made for interrogations because they grew up with reality TV. Now, how many people here watch reality TV? That gets less hands every time than Facebook. What is it about this young generation in reality TV and their obsession with drama and emotions? Well, I don't know what it is, but I know that it's perfect training for interrogations because in the interrogation room, emotions rage like wildfire. An interrogator has to understand the ability to use emotions and emotional approaches to appeal, especially to our enemies in this war, who were recruited based on emotional approaches. And the young generation gets that. So secondly, how can we go about improving interrogations, or interrogators and interrogation techniques? 3 things: training, resources, and research. We've improved the training, I can tell you. There is now, for instance, briefings on Islam, on culture in the Middle East, on history of countries. But those courses are typically taught by American soldiers or contractors who were former soldiers, not by natives. And if we want to really expose people to the culture so they can have what I call cultural acumen, the ability to use culture, not just to know it, those classes should be taught by people who grew up in it. The other thing that this is important is because our education about culture will eradicate what I believe is the root cause of why we turned to torture and abuse as a method of interrogation. And that is, we have to eradicate prejudice and stereotypes about our enemies, which are deterrents to conducting effective interrogations. The most popular book people were reading when I went through the training and when I got to Iraq to understand our enemy was The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam. This would be the equivalent of reading the Mein Kampf to understand Western Christianity. I was the only interrogator I've ever met or know of that had read the Quran. This is the religion, and the stereotypes were propagated, I can tell you, within the training, not by all, but by some, that Islam is a religion of violence. I can open up the Quran, this is the translated version that I've had since college, and read the first sentence. It says, "In the name of Allah, the compassionate, the merciful." And that's the phrase that begins every chapter in the Quran. Perhaps this is a religion of compassion and mercy. And perhaps we can use that in an interrogation if we understand the culture and quit believing stereotypes. And this is what we should be teaching our interrogators. The other thing we could improve upon is teaching them law enforcement techniques. We could bring in detectives from NYPD or LAPD and teach them how to use things like prisoner's dilemma. I was surprised when I arrived in Iraq that interrogators didn't understand that if you catch 2 people on an act, you can put them in separate rooms and use their statements to play off each other. Anybody ever seen the movie LA Confidential? Great scene with Guy Pearce where he uses this technique. You can watch it every night on Law and Order or NCIS. But interrogators aren't exposed to these techniques. They're more than capable of learning them and using them.